Okay, so today we'll talk about arts-based research, which is a very interesting research methodology or approach to research. We'll clarify that in a second. Uh, and if you want to know about arts-based research, there's probably no better person to talk to than Dr. Patricia Leavy, who is a renowned expert in qualitative research in general, but also specifically in arts-based research, as well as the author of not just nonfiction but also fiction books, who has published more than 30 books, who has received plenty of awards, too many for me to remember. So we'll talk about arts-based research. I'm really looking forward to it. So Patricia, thank you again for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Is there anything I missed in the introduction? I did my best.
No, that was great. That was great. Thank
Okay,
you.
okay. So as I said, I want to talk about arts-based research because that's so basically how it's how our communication started, but the audience may not know. I saw a post on Facebook, and I thought it's interesting. Straight away, you posted about your newest edition of your book, that is about arts-based research, and I thought it's interesting straight away. So I admit I didn't know it is a thing. I mean, I kind of suspected, of course. It occurred to me, and maybe uh, it happened to me a few times to hear something about using some form of art at some stage of research. But I admit I never thought it's a structured approach or framework. So I was really excited when I found out that it is the case. So firstly, I would like to ask you, what is arts-based research? That's probably the most important thing to start with.
Well, arts-based research involves researchers in any discipline adapting the tenets of the creative arts in their research project. And it could be for one phase of the inquiry or for the entire project. So they might use the arts for data collection or analysis and interpretation or for representation, or the arts might be used throughout. And it can literally be any art form. So narrative, fiction, poetry, visual art, audiovisual art, film, performative art, dance, music, theater. So any art form you can imagine could be adapted into an arts-based research project. And I do just want to show folks who are interested, this is the book you mentioned. It's the third edition of my book, Method Meets Art. So for people who are interested in an introduction to arts-based research, or interested in teaching it in classes or using it in their thesis work, this is a book to consider. If you want to look at the perspectives of multiple authors, there's the Handbook of Arts-Based Research, which features scholars from across the disciplines, leading researchers and newer researchers, using different kinds of arts approaches and talking about the methods and going step by step with how others can use the methods. And the publisher does have a paperback of this, so even though it's a handbook, there's actually an affordable version. So for people who, after this talk, are interested in learning more, that's one way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I'll link to both of these books in the description. That was one of my questions I was going to ask you anyway about, where we could learn about arts-based research. So it's good that you introduced these books. Also, you kind of answered some other questions as well already. So I was going to ask about the type of art. So, what exactly do we understand by art? And I was going to ask about the stages of research where we could use art. So you mentioned that it could be, for example, data collection, and I think it can definitely be, I believe, in the stage of dissemination of findings, right? Because I think that's also quite related. So maybe I think I have more questions about the dissemination or the presentation of results.
Yeah.
But before we dive into these questions, because there are more of these, I actually want to ask a question about data collection first. So, uh, see, when I thought about arts-based research, when I first heard, this term, the only thing that I could think of was using some form of art in the at the stage of data collection, but not necessarily collecting art, but like interviewing somebody and maybe using some form of art to perhaps appeal to that person, just like there are specific ways to talk to children when you interview children. I know there are many approaches to generally to develop rapport and appeal to your interviewee. So is that something? Uh, is that a thing? So basically, is that what do we understand when we say that art can be used in the data collection? Basically talking to somebody and showing them some or discussing art. Is that?
I mean,
Uh,
yes, that could be a part of a project, but I tend to think of that like photo elicitation, where you show people photographs and it becomes a part of the interview. I still think of that as traditional qualitative
mm,
research. To me, yes, you're adding a piece of art to it, but I look at that as still it's a qualitatively driven project, which is fine because that
mm,
might be appropriate for a given project. But I'll give you an example that would be, to me,
okay.
more of an arts-based project. And this is a project that actually happened that researchers did. Researchers went into a school and they wanted to talk to students about what their school experience was like.
Mm,
But instead of just doing traditional qualitative interviews, they had the students create a piece of art that
okay.
represented their experience in school. And so the art did become data in the
Mm,
study, and that was analyzed. And they did follow up and do follow up interview questions and that sort of thing, so they could elicit verbal
mm,
data from the participants as well. But this is an example where the creation of art is a part of data generation, and that art was analyzed and becomes a
mm,
part of the final research findings. So that's really, to me, an example of using arts-based research for data
mm,
collection or data generation. To me, in arts-based research, you are creating art. There
mm,
is an art creation happening. Now, I don't want to paint too broad a stroke because I don't want to exclude
mm,
people who do things they call
mm,
arts-based research, which it's fine. I mean, anytime you come up with a generalization, you're going to leave some things out unintentionally. So, and I like to think broadly and be inclusive and include as many as want to be included under the sort of rubric of arts-based research. But I do think that generally speaking, the creation of art is a part of it, whether that creation happens during data generation, analysis, representation, or the entire inquiry. And
mm,
you did mention dissemination earlier, and I know you wanted to speak more about it. I think your instinct was right. I think when
mm,
you heard arts-based research, you probably thought it's most commonly used for dissemination.
mm.
And I think that's true. I think it is most commonly used to represent data because you can speak to various audiences, which is something I'm sure we'll talk more about.
Yeah.
But it can be used during all the phases of research.
Mm. Yeah, this is very interesting, and I'm happy that you clarified this because it does clarify the whole concept to me because I did wonder, and just like you said, what I mentioned is not necessarily art-based research; it's just research that involves some kind of art in it. But now it makes sense. So I think what you said. You said it's research that involves the creation of art. So I think that's a wonderful definition of arts-based research. And I just remember that I'm not sure if I think poems could be a form of art.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So.
And if people are interested in that, I just want to, there's a wonderful book by a scholar named Sandra Faulkner on poetic inquiry. It's one of my
Mm,
favorite arts-based research books. There are many books about specific genres, so if people
mm,
are interested just in a specific genre. But Sandra Faulkner's book on poetic inquiry is really terrific. But yes, that's another example.
mm,
And sometimes it's participants making the poems,
yeah.
sometimes it's the researchers creating the poems. Sometimes found poems are used and then reimagined into something else. So there are many different ways that
Mm.
poetic inquiry might happen.
Yeah, this sounds so interesting. I love the idea what you mentioned first about research conducted in schools where you ask the students or children to create something, and it's again it just sounds so interesting. And I remembered, in my work as a research assistant and in my data analysis experiences, I remember working on a project where university students were asked to to write poems. These were students, I think, in Japan or China. They were asked to write poems about English. It was research into English as a lingua franca, as a global language. They were supposed to write poems about English. So I was analyzing these poems, quite a few, I think 150, and now only now do I understand that perhaps this was my first experience with arts-based research. This is interesting.
Absolutely. And also, I would just add that one of the benefits of doing this kind of work is you can get at data that otherwise would be invisible. So, for example, in the study I mentioned where they went into the schools and
Mm,
had kids draw themselves, there was one participant who drew a cropped picture of her face. And when she was asked why she did that, she talked about how she feels so closed in and boxed in at
mm,
school. But that data might never have come out if they had just done interviews or focus groups. Depending on the questions they asked, that might not have been elicited, but it came through
mm,
because she created this artwork. So you can
mm,
actually get at different data than might otherwise be available, which is true of
mm.
all research methods. I mean, I think quantitative research is very useful for a certain set of things. You can get at certain things. And the same is true for qualitative, and I would say the same is true for art space. You can actually get at different data.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, what you said about qualitative as well. I personally, I don't like to conduct or analyze quantitative data, but I always stress that it is important. I mean, there are wonderful things that can be achieved with quantitative research. So of course, just like you said, every kind of research is valuable. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about possible research studies and how it can be implemented, and I can imagine that it's such an effective, such a great, powerful tool for specifically investigating sensitive issues, because you mentioned that student who drew her face, and straight away it hit me that if we want to investigate, specifically focus on sensitive issues, or imagine a study of bullying, or a study of some self-esteem issues, again it's a great way to express these feelings, especially if you're anxious to talk about these things, especially in case of children again. So I can imagine. So it's just for whoever's watching, for the audience to consider definitely, and read a little bit more. I'll link all the books that you mentioned. I'll put the links in the description. It's just definitely worth considering these ideas. And as I said, I have lots of ideas about lots of questions about dissemination. And just so you know, I mean, hopefully you figured by now that I really like this idea. I'm quite excited about this whole concept. So the questions I have are, of course, not to question and criticize, but rather, playing devil's advocate. So because I have some questions that I can imagine people could raise, and I can imagine some academics could raise certain concerns. So yeah, so let's dive
Go
right
for it.
into it. Yeah. So okay, so I'm just reading all these questions. I've got quite a few. So the first question is, of course, about the audience. So dissemination, so presenting the findings. So let's imagine, based on the results, we write a book, or develop a play or some other form of art. So I wondered, well, who will watch it? It sounds harsh, but who exactly do we expect, or do we want, or do we hope, let's say, to watch that play? Because I was wondering, if we want to reach academics, for example, will this be the first place they look for, things or whatever they are looking for? Uh, it may not be, and it may not be a problem. Perhaps we just maybe that's the whole problem. Perhaps we should rethink, what research is, where we look for research, and all kinds of questions. But that was the first question that came to my mind. So I imagined a scholar conducting research and then sharing that research in some innovative, different form, such as I said, play, which is fine if and I'm I completely support the idea of trying to popularize science and research and reach the wide audience. But what about this traditional, so to speak, audience, academic audience? Is it something
It's
that
a
you're
really
interested
important question. So I'm glad that you're asking these questions because I do think that these are questions people have out there, especially graduate students,
in?
people early in their
Yeah.
career who might be attracted to these approaches and want to try them, but they have these concerns because there are traditional ways that academia works. So the first thing that I will say, I have a few things to say. The
Yeah.
first thing I will say is that all researchers should think about audience. Quantitative researchers, qualitative researchers, arts-based researchers. The problem with much of academic reporting is that the researchers are not thinking about audience at all, inside or outside the academy. The reality is that the majority of academic journal articles are not read by anyone. So this idea that they're largely read in the academy, first of all, is completely false. You know, in some disciplines, in social sciences and education, over 90% of published journal articles have an audience of 3 to 8 readers. That's nobody, okay?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true.
that's no one. People spend years to get a journal article published, often involves years of research and then submitting and the submission process and revise and resubmit. By the time something comes out, you've usually invested years in it. Which I would also point to the fact that by the time most journal articles are published, they're actually outdated.
I was going to say that.
I mean, that is like, I am a dirty truth teller. And that is a dirty truth of the academic journal system.
Yeah, I love it.
Is that by the time they come out, they're completely erroneous often. Or they're less relevant. Sometimes they're not relevant at all, because if it's a very timely topic and you've done interviews and now they're being published 3, 4, 5 years later, the world moves pretty quickly, how relevant it's at. But it turns out it doesn't matter because nobody's going to read those articles anyway. So it's actually a problem for all research that we don't think about audience enough. And those articles that do have an audience, which is about 10% of journal articles, have what anyone would consider any kind of reasonable audience, even a small audience, but a reasonable audience. It's about 10%. But that audience is exclusively in the academy. So it's really a very elitist system in which we're just circulating knowledge among ourselves. And most people become academics and scholars, as I did, because we're interested in contributing to knowledge in the world that, even if on a very small scale, might have some benefit beyond our own career, beyond a line on our CV. So before I address arts-based research in the audience, which I will, because I know that was a part of your question, I just want to say we should be thinking about audience for all our research. The journal system is a broken system. It's going to go like the card catalog in libraries. It's a dinosaur system that it just doesn't work. When 90% of what people are doing isn't read by anyone, and people are doing it because they have to for the structure of the academy to get tenure, to get promoted, but they're not actually doing any good with their research other than what they might personally get from it. And is that really enough? I think most people would say, no, that's not really enough. And then they're not reaching people outside of the academy at all. I mean, it's amazing to me how many wonderful social justice scholars we have now across the disciplines. But what does social justice mean if you're not doing research that's accessible to the public? So I'm a big believer in popularizing research. And one of the things I like about arts-based research is it draws our attention to the issue of audience for all research. Because people never say who's the audience for quantitative research, but they should. We should say it for all research. And so I really love this about arts-based research, that it draws out these conversations. So to get to what I think your question actually was, I have not forgotten, the audience for arts-based research, it could be both academic and non-academic audiences. And that's one of the benefits, is that you have the ability to reach both academic and non-academic audiences. So for example, my novels are based on my research. My novels are arts-based research. Fiction is the method that I use. And my novels are read in the academy, in undergraduate and graduate courses, and they are read by general audiences. They have the ability to be both inside and outside of the academy. So if someone does a play, which was one of your questions, there are many scholars who do ethnodrama, which is a method of using qualitative research to create a play. So ethnodrama and ethnotheater are sort of the terms that arts-based researchers would use, but they're creating plays, writing scripts, creating plays. And there are many that have been performed. Some have been performed 200 to 300 times. I know some Canadian researchers who are in theater companies that do ethnodrama, who are scholars at universities, who have shows that have been performed across Canada, at
Interesting.
schools, in hospitals, in community centers. Now, some ethnodramas or ethno theater performances only happen one time. So sometimes there's just one audience, and if it's 60 people in that room or 300, or that's the audience, which I would still argue is a larger audience than most
Yeah.
academic research gets. And there's another part of your question, which is about, is there another component to this? And if you're doing an ethnodrama, you may or may not perform it live for an audience, but you can also publish the script. That might be a book. And there are many books that are based on ethnodramas, for example. You might also publish, if you want to speak just to academics, you might publish scholarly articles. So a lot of research methods journals, qualitative journals, arts-based journals, art education journals publish arts-based research or articles about arts-based research. So many people publish those as well. So sometimes people wear dual hats because they want to speak to both audiences, and sometimes people do it because they're strategic, and until we figure out how to restructure the academy in a way that makes more sense to doing popular, meaningful research, people have to play that game. But you can, because journals do publish this work, and they do it across the disciplines.
Okay, yeah, this was a great response, and I wish I could. I mean, I'll remember this as I rewatch the whole thing, because I had so many questions that I may not remember now. But I mean, so many great points that you made, and especially about academia and being a broken system in general, publishing and articles being a broken system. I really love these, because I often mention this kind of make this kind of observations in my videos. So my audience, I'm sure they know that I can be quite critical of academia. I definitely agree about this idea. I mean, like I said, I love the idea of popularizing research and the findings, of course, from that research. I completely agree that it doesn't seem to make any sense that it's all in that closed environment. And what is even worse, you mentioned that the reason we become researchers and academics, quite often we are, we are passionate about research, and we are naive enough to think that I will change the world. I will publish it, people will use it, will read it, will change things, will develop policies. And what really annoys me, it's not really about art-based research now, but what really annoys me is that in these articles, in these published articles, everybody talks about the implications, of course. So every time obviously quite a standard structure of an article, where after you discuss your findings, you talk about the implications of findings. So what we're gonna do with these findings, what can be done with these findings, and in that section, of course, everybody says these findings will be useful for policymakers and these people and these people and these people, and then what happens is that same person just forgets about the whole thing and starts working on the next article, and then talks about the implications again, and they don't even try, they don't even care about the only reason they talk about implications is because they have to. And I'm not saying everybody is like that, of course, and also there's a whole group of people who are like that, but only because they have to be, because it's what you mentioned.
It's not their
Yeah.
fault. It's the system. I
Yeah.
mean, if you are in a system, look, a corrupt system will breed corruption. It's the same kind of
Yeah.
thing. And this is a broken system where people's livelihood is on the line, their professional standing is on the line, their ability to have freedom is on the line with tenure, all of these things. So they are incentivized. They are forced to do this to maintain. It's like running on a hamster wheel, though. You don't get anywhere. The entire system of academic publishing just puts everyone on a hamster wheel where you run and you run and you run, but you don't get anywhere. And I think academics deserve better. I think those researchers need to be freed from that system so that they can do work that is meaningful to them, so that they can make a difference like they want to. so that at some point in their career, they haven't lost the hope that they can make a difference in the world. Because our world needs people who believe they can make a difference. We desperately need people to believe they can make
Oh
a
yeah.
difference. So we have to create a system in which that becomes possible.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem, is twofold, of this broken system that you mentioned, because here, we have academics who, even if they wanted to, they can't make that difference because they are expected to, publish another article this year, and there you have the general public who, perhaps they would love to make the difference, but they don't even have access to that research, as you said, and this is probably what annoys me most is, that as a it should be everybody's priority that these findings are accessible, because what's the point otherwise? As you said, there are audiences that for some articles it can be 3 or 5 people that will ever read it. So so what's the point? The whole point is, of course, to reach a lot of people, and this is why it just kind of makes sense to have this group of people who are more qualified to do research. So they are representing, let's say, that this whole uh, society, but then their hard work should be handed over, or not handed over, but shown to the whole rest of the people who still, it's almost like saying, oh, these people are useless anyway because they don't have a degree, so why show them the results? It feels a little bit like that, to be
Yes,
honest.
it is. I mean, it's really an elitist system,
Mm.
and I that's an ugly word, and people don't like it, but it's the truth. I mean, it's a system where people with PhDs or MDs only speak to other people with
Yeah.
PhDs or MDs. What else do you call that?
Hmm.
And the idea that even 3 to 5 people read these articles, I also think is an overestimated number. I actually think
Hmm.
nobody reads them, because 3 to 5 people, they cited them. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean they read it. That doesn't mean they
Oh
learned
yeah,
anything. It means
exactly.
they were advancing their own agenda for the
Hmm.
article they have to publish to get tenure and promotion, and so the cycle continues. But I've always had a feeling that, when you're doing research, you should be able to get in a taxi cab in any city in the world and be able to explain what you're doing in 2 sentences to that cab driver, and he, she, or they should be able to understand what you've said.
Mm.
And that means you're doing something that has the potential to be useful. And it's not about dumbing anything down. It's not about not doing rigorous work. It's not about any of that. The fact is, it's actually really difficult to speak simply about complicated topics. And that is something that we as academics should be able to do. Researchers need to speak simply about topics, because if they do want to reach those policymakers,
Yeah.
like you mentioned, they better not be talking like an academic with a bunch of jargon, because that policymaker is not an academic.
Yeah,
Um, so,
exactly.
so other people just don't relate in the same way to, all the jargon that we use and that kind of thing. So really, we need to find different ways to make our research accessible. Arts-based research is merely one way that can be done. And it happens to be what appeals to me and how I enjoy doing my research and sharing it. And what I also like about it is, if somebody reads a journal article I published, and I have published many, so
Mm.
I've been in that system, I understand it from the inside out. But if somebody reads one of my journal articles, I bet that most of the time, if not all of the time, they're only doing so to advance their own research agenda. Whereas if someone reads one of my novels, I believe they are choosing to read it. And
Mm.
therefore, I believe it actually makes an impression on them, especially if they happen to like it. If they happen to like it, as all art does, if you happen to like a movie or a novel or whatever, or music, it makes an impression on you.
Mm.
So the fact that people enjoy something is a benefit. It's not a negative. And
Yeah.
this level of like choice that you give people, that they want to engage in something. And even, I left academia to write full time in 2012, but I was a professor for more than 10 years. And so I taught many, many classes. I'm a sociologist, so I was a
Mm.
sociology professor. And I would bring different things into classrooms. My students read textbooks, they read monographs, they read journal articles, they read novels, they watched films. And I can tell you that the things that always inspired the most livening conversations were novels and
Mm.
films, or personal essays that people had written, the kinds of writing that actually involve the
Mm.
tenets of literary writing, like involve
Mm.
the skills of good writing, which academic journal articles, that's another problem with them, is that for the most part, they're not actually well written. Like
Yeah.
they don't use language in the way that a novelist would, or, they're not engaging, or even that a good reporter would, to
Mm.
get our attention through creative nonfiction or an editorial or whatever it might be. They just don't attend to that because they're too busy following the structure that you mentioned earlier, which is something that nobody wants to read. I mean, I'm a sociologist and I don't want to read sociology journal articles, but give me a great novel, send me to a great play, and I'm in. I will spend my time doing that.
Yeah. Again, plenty of powerful and good points that you made here. I mean, firstly, of course, the whole it's a topic for another long discussion. The whole how isolated and separated and diluted sometimes the whole academia and academic world is, and the best example for that is even when I talked to somebody once about the skills, the research skills that are sought outside academia. So in companies doing research and user research and industry research in general. So what kind of skills are they looking for? And sure enough, I mean they of course are looking for research skills, but that conversation was about the demand. So basically, if I have a PhD, will they need me? Will they give me the job because I have a PhD? Obviously, I know about research, and this person said no, not necessarily. Quite often the problem is once they take on somebody with a PhD, they do obviously end up sometimes employing some PhD graduates. But the first thing they need to do after that is to unteach them a lot of things that they learned in the university, because and this is about the way, even here we were talking about the language of course mainly, but it's also reflected in uh, the way they do research, what they focus on. So again, because this is this structure that's imposed on them. So again, they, in user research, so in practical research, they just want, let's say, to talk to the users of a given software or whatever. They just quickly want to collect that data, ask these people, do you like it, do you not like it, and this academic person or the student comes in and starts asking what about validity and reliability and philosophy and worldviews, and they're like, why do we don't need that stuff. So, and the same is about the language, of course. So like all the points that you made about the language and the the stiff language of publishing of academic articles, uh, and I think what I wanted to point out, you mentioned you talked about emotions a little bit, about emotional response. I think this is very important because, and would you agree that one of the reasons that arts-based research is a good, it can be a good and effective and approach to research or methodology. I was going to ask you, I still don't know how to how to categorize it. uh, is it because of two things? So one thing is that inherently we are drawn to art in one form or another, and two, because emotions is a big part of not just our life but specifically of how we remember, because I once read that we remember through emotions. So that's why sometimes you remember something that happened 20 years ago and you know exactly what you were wearing or what you were eating, because that was some emotional moment for one reason or another. And sometimes you forget what you did an hour ago, and because there was no emotion, it's not that important to your brain. And just to add to that, I use this technique that I read about after that, where if you are experiencing a really good, powerful, great moment that you don't want to forget, and I did it in, we talked about Greece before we started recording, and I did it in Greece. There was one moment I felt extremely happy, just enjoying swimming in the sea, and rather than just trying to remember the whole situation, I only focus on remembering this exact emotion. I just became really self-aware of that, of what I'm feeling, and I really tried hard to just try to remember that emotion. This is just something I had read before, and it worked, and it was a few years ago, and I really remember that moment because of that emotion. So again, just to summarize, so do you think it's because we, one, have this attraction to art inherently, and two, because of emotions, and because the forms that you're describing are appealing to our emotions?
Yes, I mean, I think both of those things are critical. And I've experienced that myself releasing novels over the years. So my first novel came out about 10 years ago. It was called Low Fat Love. It's not great. Okay, so I want to put that out there because I think it's important. I mean, I look at it as like mediocre at best because it was my first attempt. I wasn't really sure what I was doing. It was very honest and raw, but it's not great. So you don't have to be brilliant to be trying this. But I put that novel out, and the response to that novel literally changed my life and has changed the decade that's come since, both inside the academy from students and colleagues and professors, and outside the academy from general readers. I was absolutely bombarded with emails, notes. When I would go to a conference or do a book event, people would line hallways to wait and talk to me, always to do the same thing, to whisper their own story to me, that something in the novel had stirred up. And that novel is really about, in a lot of ways, loneliness and low self-esteem, and ultimately it's about empowerment, but it's pretty dark. All the characters are isolated. They all have trauma. And it's just a dark, lonely sort of book. And I think it's about the loneliness that happens in people's homes and apartments when they are just alone, or feel a sense of aloneness. So, and it was based on interviews I had done for almost 10 years that I had sort of nowhere to put my cumulative ideas. So I wrote this novel, Low Fat Love. And the title is about like settling in life and love. And anyway, the response to it, I mean, you can't imagine the stories. To this day, I get emails. 10 years later, I get emails about this book. People would tell me about domestic violence they were experiencing, sexual assault, suicide attempts, depression, alcoholism. The dean at a university took me out to coffee to tell me she was an alcoholic. And nobody she's worked with for 10 or 20 years had known that, but she read the book. And so, yes, the emotional response is just incredible. And for the last 10 years, I've been consistently releasing novels, and the response is always different. So it's not always the same. Like that had a very strong emotional response, but the responses I get compared to the responses to nonfiction. Now, when Low Fat Love came out, I had published like, I don't know, at least a dozen nonfiction books, maybe more. So I was not someone who was unfamiliar with what it meant to publish a book. And that's my point, because this reaction was so completely different. And fast forward to now, I think I have it here. Yes, I do. My latest novel, Shooting Stars, which is my personal favorite, just came out a month ago. So it's brand new. It's called Shooting Stars. This one's my favorite. And the response to this, the emails I've gotten from people, it's a love story, but it's about all different kinds of love. So romantic love, friendship, love of art, passion for what you do. But really it's about love and healing from trauma and different kinds of trauma. So there are some pretty raw points in this book. And although it's ultimately, I think, very hopeful and happy book. But the response to this book, and I've done some book clubs for it by Zoom, and the things people have said about their own lives, shared about their past, things that, you know, I mean, I had one woman who I've never met email me through Facebook to tell me that after she read it, she will forever treat her husband differently. Because the way these characters treat each other, it's so beautiful. Everybody in this book, they treat each other so beautifully with like such grace, which I did on purpose as a model for what people, but this woman read the book and took that from it, messaged me to tell me she will never speak to her husband the way she used to. She will always,
this is
but
great.
this is an emotional response. And this is something that woman is going to remember this novel in 5 years and in 10 years. There is no journal article I have ever read, ever. And I'm an academic, I'm a nerd, I like this stuff, that I remember. I usually don't remember them that evening when I'm having dinner, let alone. And to answer your point, there's one more thing I want to say about this emotional thing. There's actually research out there. So for the people out there who are more sort of hard science folks who, you know, this seems a little out there to them, there's actually incredible research on the neuroscience of art and how we consume art. and how we experience art. For example, there's one whole field that's been dubbed literary neurofiction, neuroscience.
Mm.
And it's so interesting. It's all about what happens physiologically to us when we're reading fiction. And there's this one study that researchers did about reading Jane Austen novels. And in short, what they found is that when people are reading Jane Austen novels, there are parts of the brain that are activated that researchers did not know were involved in reading. So things that are involved with our senses, like our sense of touch and stuff. So when you're reading a novel that you happen to love and you're completely engrossed and you feel like the house could burn down and you wouldn't notice, that's actually something physiological that's happening to you. There's neuroscience to support that. There's a neuroscientist named Gregory Burns, and he and a team published an article in Brain Connectivity, which is a big neuroscience journal. And in short, they said that the effects of reading a novel, these connections we see, they last for days after you've read the novel. Whereas if you read nonfiction prose, that's not the case. The activations you have are just in that moment. It lasts for days after a novel. So yeah, so what you're getting at in this emotional thing, I know it might be going further than you expected, but you're really onto something important, that this emotional connection people have if they are engaged in that piece of art. It won't happen with every piece of art. It won't happen with a movie you don't like or a song you don't like. But for something that you like or that jars you or surprises you or engages you, something that gives you an emotional response, there's actually neuroscience to support that it will produce lasting impressions, lasting learning. And you will feel those emotions, you know, many years down the line, which explains to me why I have some people who read Low Fat Love almost 10 years ago who still email me once a year about this book, because they remember the characters and the feelings in a way that you would just never have with traditional academic reporting.
Yeah, this is great. As always, as with all your responses, there are so many different points that you made that I wanted to comment on, but now, you know, I don't even know where to start. But definitely, it's interesting. I mean, firstly, as you said, not every piece of art will evoke these emotions, but no research will. So at least, yeah. So here we are, and what you said as well about not remembering, you know, what you read. It's good that you mentioned that, because, you know, it's been a while since I did my PhD, but and only now did I realize it was normal, because I remember reading, you know, all these articles, and obviously I was immersed in that, and I was supposed to know, and I had this general knowledge, like that accumulates, and you start to understand the field, you know, and what the findings are, what we know. But in terms of individual articles, I would argue, just like you said, that there definitely weren't many that I actually remembered. So, you know, it was it's quite funny, and so it makes sense. And all the research, I think, you know, for people watching this conversation may be very interesting, because we obviously talked about so many interesting things in general. You mentioned that research into how we react, how our brain reacts when we read, and this kind of thing. So, you know, it's just interesting, even, you know, not necessarily in the context of what we're talking about, but generally, you know, just great knowledge, great facts to know. And I find it easy to imagine that this is the case. And just even, you know, the simplest example of when we imagine ourselves reading our favorite book and how we react, and, you know, how we later can't forget, not just, you know, the events, but literally emotionally can't forget, or, you know, can't deal with something that happened, even though we know, you know, it's a book. So it definitely, like, the point is, you don't, you know, I wouldn't need to be convinced that there is definitely this connection, just by looking at how, you know, I myself react, you know, to my favorite books and characters.
I
So
think what this research does is it shows us what we intuitively know. I mean, we know that when we go to a movie, we might cry, we might laugh, we might have an emotional response. So this science is just proving what most people already know. So if we sort of let go of our assumptions about what academic research should be, then we can embrace the idea of what it might be, and embrace the idea of appealing to things that are actually very human and that we all probably experience in our own personal lives.
definitely, and it's a good reason. So if you are a student, for example, you're thinking of, you know, considering this whole idea of arts-based research. I think this is another reason why the points that we just made are important, are relevant, because it's just a good, strong argument. So again, we are obviously now in this academic world where you have to have, provide arguments, you have to support these arguments with scientific evidence. So this is scientific evidence why arts-based research is needed and why it is effective, what you just said. So if somebody does a little bit of searching and finds these studies that say here it is, so this is how we remember things, this is how emotions work, this is what's happening when we are watching or reading something. So I think it kind of refers to what we said before, that somebody may be interested but maybe a little bit anxious because they will start wondering, how will this come across. So yeah, so I think it's great. And just another point about the impact of your book, and when you mention people writing to you, and doesn't it feel great, because I think this is the impact that everybody would love to have. So we talked about the impact, the impact before, where you're a student and you're supposed to make an impact, but then it's just in theory. And here it's real life, real impact. And even to have one person that you manage to help this way, it must be a great feeling. So that's just another reason why all of this is so interesting.
It's an amazing feeling. And I would say one thing to people listening who might be interested in trying this approach is that I really do find, if you are doing work that touches your own heart and engages you and is something that you forget to stop and have lunch because you are so engaged in it, which is what it's like for me writing a novel. And I know many arts-based researchers, whatever their genre, could be doing graphic novels, it could be doing plays, it could be writing music, that when it touches them, first of all, that's a great feeling too, but it usually means you're onto something and it is likely going to touch other people. And that is just something that sometimes is missing from our research. We might be interested in a topic, we might be intellectually engaged in it, but that's not necessarily the same thing as being moved. Even when we interview people, we're not always like deeply moved by what we learn. But there is this process when you're creating art that you have that ability to be moved. And if you can get to that place where it touches you, it's fun to you, it's engaging to you, it will be that for other people. Whether it's a small audience or a large audience, don't worry about it. It's less relevant. You'll find the audience that's right for you at that time. And things can grow over time too. So because, a piece of art can have a small audience now, but a large audience later, which is very different than an academic journal article whose relevancy really exists when it first comes out, if at all. So that's not the case for a piece of art that might even be timeless to people. So, but if it touches you, if you are engaged while you're doing it, it's likely to bring that to other people.
Yeah, I think this is generally an extremely powerful advice. So even if you don't end up carrying out arts-based research, I think this single piece of advice would be, so universal and so applicable to not only anything you do in life, which even more universal, but even specifically to research. So whatever kind of research you're doing, because this is something I always said about choosing a research topic. Something students often ask me. Always the first thing that I say is, the absolutely the most important thing to start with is that you have to be passionate about it, and you have to want to know the answers to your research questions. Not develop your research questions because, well, I mean, it's an important factor, but not just because there is a gap in research, there is a need in the field. So all these again, academic phrases, you have to want to know the answers, and that's when it becomes, it's not a burden to yourself, and as you said, probably to your participants as well, and to people around you. So yeah, so I think it was a great advice, and of course, if you want to do arts-based research, then it's even more relevant. So I think that's all. I was going to ask you where to learn about arts-based research, but you did mention quite a few sources, and I will make sure to include all of these and put them into description. So I hope and I imagine that people would love to read, and I think I would love to read more about it because it's really, it's really fascinating, this whole topic. So yeah, so once again, and I was going to ask you for advice, some general advice. I didn't know what kind of advice. I was thinking, and I think again, you just did it. This was a great piece of advice that you said at the end about, this passion. So I would like to thank you again for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you so much for having me. I love this conversation. So much fun.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Maybe some other time we'll talk about even more topics.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.